Hey, welcome back. Your fearless leader here, moving ahead with the picture frames that we talked about the other day. I don't know if you remember, but we glued together two frames. We had one frame that had a little issue, but it seems like it straightened out with just clamping it up and gluing it a certain way. The other frame that I have here is the one that I'm going to clean up and show you guys how to clean it up. There's probably nothing worse and more boring than watching somebody clean up 8 miters. Oh no, I take that back. Probably sanding. Watching someone sand is probably worse than that. No, I take that back. Watching somebody sand, actually sanding it is the worst. So I'm going to try to speed this along, and with the interest of time in mind, what I did was I cleaned up the one picture frame that I had for my, let me see, that was for my daughter. That was the good one. And now I'm cleaning up the one for my son who doesn't call me. I'll do a good job with this. We're going to clean this one up and see how we do this. What I did was, if you remember, I had that Merle clamp that clamped on all 4 miters and tightened everything up. I broke that down, rolled it up, made sure I didn't get snapped by the recoil on the strap. I put the clamps back. The next thing that I did was I got out some things that will probably help me in cleaning these miters up. I have a hand plane, which is basically this chisel held at a 45-degree angle. I could use a chisel, or what I could use unconventionally is a paint scraper. Believe it or not, out of these 3 things, I choose the most unconventional one. The paint scraper gives me the most amount of flexibility in terms of me putting pressure and clamping the board down, putting pressure on the joint that I want to clean up. And it allows me not to rip into the grain. Whenever I scrape something, it's probably taking off maybe about 1/28 of an inch. And the other thing is, I think I have more control with this paint scraper than I do with a hand plane. The other thing with a hand plane is that the setting of the blade to the table on the plane has to be such that you don't take off too much where you tear the grain up, and you don't take off too little where you're not planing anything down. I always think that this is a little bit more complex, a little harder to work with. The one that has the least amount of control is a chisel. Just to take this chisel and chisel into the miters, to me, is always a sketchy topic, because if I dig down, I'm going to dig into the surface or the edge of the board, and I really don't want to do that. What I'm going to do to clean up the 2 miters that I have to work on, I'm going to not use this hand plane. I'll come back and I'll use this when I'm putting my splines in. Remember, a spline we talked about the last time reinforces the miter. I'm going to definitely use that hand plane when I reinforce the miter. But right now, what I'm going to do is I'll use the scraper to clean up the front edge and the back edge. And then I'm going to use the chisel just to even out the miters on their surfaces. So let's take a look, and I'm going to kind of draw your attention over to this. Here are 2 miters that I cleaned up already. If you look over here and over here, those miters are nice and even with the surface, and I could feel the difference. The other thing that I was able to do, and I should say I wasn't able to do, was to scrape the glue that spilled out on the outside of that miter. Let me see if I did it here. Nope, I actually didn't do that on any of these, and this is a pretty quick fix. The other thing that I did do, if I feel the backside, I clean these backside miter edges, that inside edge, which is the side you're never going to see. I clean those up with a scraper. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to clean up the outside edge of the miter. Now, I say that this is an edge because, remember, I didn't have my board flat so that the surface was exposed. I decided that I wanted to see the edge of the board. Can I find my miter? My picture frame, I can't, but here it is. If you compare these two, you notice that this one over here has a surface showing. You notice this has the edge showing. And I said to you, again, it's personal preference. Some people like to see more wood. Some people say, I don't want the wood to steal from the picture. So what I'm going to do is make it more of a shadow box look so that the edge is facing out. And I have 13/16 of an inch on this width of this board. And that's what I want to do, is just kind of highlight my picture. So if I take this one, I'm just going to move that surface frame piece away, and I'm going to start to clamp this up. Most common mistake that people make in our shop is when I say to somebody, we'll start to clean this up. What do you want to use? Scraper, hand plane, chisel. I'll use a paint scraper, and this is what happens. They'll take this and they'll start doing this. And then the frame is moving every which way. So then I say, you got to clamp it down. Well, if I take this and put it in the vise and clamp it, I am supporting this area, which is okay. I can do it that way, but no one ever takes the board and flips it around. What they'll do is they'll scrape this miter, but if you look, this miter is not supported. So they start to scrape this comes up, and sometimes it breaks the miter, because remember, the only thing that's holding these two miters together is glue. There's nothing else that reinforces, there's no other joint. Here's the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to use the smart man's way of doing it. And I know that this kills everyone. I'm going to take 7 steps over to that glue table, that glue area, and I'm going to get one of these deep throat clamps. As a matter of fact, I'm going to get 2 of them. So let me see if I can go over there. Of course, I did it already because I plan ahead and I'm wise. I'm going to take my clamp. What I want to do is lay my board on its surface exactly, or I should say on its edge facing up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a clamp right here on this long edge. And then I'm going to take my other clamp and I'm going to put it on the short edge. Just drop it down. Again, I'm tightening it clockwise. And this is a relatively easy thing to do. I'm going to take my paint scraper, and like I said to you guys, with anything that you do, you want to be a great basketball player. When you're taking your foul shot, you want to bend your knees when you take your foul shot. Nobody ever shoots a ball like this. If you're skiing, nobody ever skis successfully like this down the mountain. You will see people bend their knees, bend their knees, bend their knees. You want to do the same exact approach when I'm scraping this miter. So I'm going to take my scraper, I'm going to bend my knees as I do this. I'm putting pressure in as I come up towards me, and as I come towards me, and I'm going to lift it up as I go back. So I'm not scraping it like this. I'm putting pressure down, pulling this back, and I'm going to lift it up when I come back in that direction. So it's kind of like that motion. The other thing I want you to see is that we have grain running in this direction, grain running in this direction. Another common mistake that people make is that they get overzealous and they just start tearing this up. Well, if I tear this up, this grain is going to chip because it goes against the grain of the direction that I'm scraping. So what I want to kind of do is, I call it finesse. I'm going to kind of take this, move it in this direction, but blend it out to that miter. Look at how much I'm taking off. Just a hair. And the other question is, how much do I have to do this? Well, I've cleaned out the glue. I'm going to close my eyes and touch it like I'm getting intimate. Ooh. I don't feel a difference between those two edges. So that's telling me right now that's good. I like the way this one feels. Believe it or not, it feels identical to this one and that one. I'll do my last one. And I can feel that this side, this edge is raised up a little bit above this one. So I'm going to start in the area that's a little bit above. Notice I'm bending my knees and I'm finessing this. I am finessing this. The other thing that people tend to do is they get really into this and they start taking a lot off. You don't want your miter to drop down. Again, I'm going to close my eyes, touch this. I could feel that this area is raised up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend this out a bit. I'm going to take this and simply blend this out. So now if I close my eyes and touch this, that feels pretty even, and this is going to feel pretty even. So right there, that miter is pretty good on its edge. And take a look at my waist here. That's how much I took off, so little. I'm going to take the board. I'm going to flip it over to the other side. because I'm on a roll here. And look at these miters on this side. If you look at them, they're very small because I cut a rabbet on the back side. So what I want to do is I'm going to clamp this down. And maybe I can get away with one clamp. Nope, it's going to pivot. So I'll move it over to this side. I'll clamp this down. And now what I'm going to do is same exact way. Just finesse it. I just want to clean up this back side. Sometimes when people are doing this for the first time, I'll tell them to do the back side first. That way if they screw it up or they do too much, I'll tell them they won't screw up their project because they'll never see it. This is the side that goes up against the wall. I'm going to move on to this one. This miter was pretty even to begin with, so I'm just touching that. So I'm in good shape. The other thing I want to look at, since I have this so that the rabbet is exposed, is I want to look in each one of these corners and see, is there any glue in there that spilled out? Not really. That looks pretty good. This one looks pretty good. Let's come over to this one. That's not bad. Let's take a look at this one. This one isn't bad either. This might be a little bit uneven. So I'm just going to take my chisel, invert it, and I'll lift that up a little bit. So if I look at that, they're all pretty even. The next thing that I want to do, and this is an easy thing to do, is I'm going to clean up those outside miters. Remember, I have glue over here. I take it, put it in the vise, and now I'm not going to use my paint scraper, I'm going to use my chisel. Please watch the way I do this, because this is a very common mistake that people make. They'll hold on to the board for some reason, just like this, and they chisel it. As soon as they slip with the chisel, they pull one of these. So if you notice, when I'm going to chisel this down, what I want to do is I'm putting my hand so it's not exposed to that chisel. If I were to slip, I'm not going to cut my hand because my hand is below the angle at which that chisel's at. So if I do this, I did it on the outside over here of this surface. Let me move over to the opposite side, the mating surface. That surface actually feels pretty good, so I can get away with that one. Let's take a look over here. I see yellow. So what I want to do is I want to take that yellow out. Of course, everybody knows that that yellow is glue. Same exact position with my hands. I'm going to put my hand below that surface. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that chisel from side to side, like I'm shearing that miter. I'm not just going at it like I'm trying to kill a wild animal, like some people do it. I'm shearing it. I'm moving that from side to side. The other thing that you should notice is that this chisel is sharp, because this jackass over here sharpens them every single day. When I was in college, my professor said to me, do you know that a sharp chisel is a lot less dangerous than a dull chisel? Because when I start to cut with this sharp chisel, it actually cuts. If it were a dull chisel, I'd be struggling with it. And that's when people slip, and that's when injuries occur. So when I go across here, you notice that the wood is just kind of jumping off of that. Of course, there is that experience is the best teacher sort of thing. Like after you do this for a while, it becomes a lot easier. People always say to me, how does he do that? Well, he's been doing it for so long. Look, you guys have hair, I don't. Look, big ears, you guys don't. Regular size ears. Look, long nose, you don't. Look, regular size, you guys have regular size noses. I have two more miters to clean up, this one over here, this one over here. So without further ado, I put it in the vise. I'm moving it from side to side, shearing it. And someone says, hey, why don't you just move it over to this side? I could, but sometimes the grain dictates that I shouldn't do that. On this miter, it actually worked out very well. Last miter, take it, flip it. Again, I'm going to use the chisel. I'll do this surface. This is the surface now, kids. It's not the edge. So I do that surface. I'm going to slide over. Will it clean up on this side? Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. So right there, I have cleaned up my outside edge, which everybody's going to see, my backside edge. Do you really need to do the backside? It's like anything else. If you make a project and you put a lot of love and care into it, wouldn't you want the backside to look just as good as the front side? People go, I'm never gonna see that. A lot of times I'll see that with people when they're making that short table project. I'm only gonna see that outside surface. Why do I need to clean up the bottom side? Because no one ever touches a tabletop like this. Everybody will always put their hand in it. So I always say that it should be cleaned up at least 3 inches around the entire perimeter of a tabletop, because that's the way people touch it. Right now, these are all cleaned up, ready to go. So my next spot on this would be, could I route it? No. I want to reinforce these miters, because I said to you, the miter is the weakest joint of all, because it's simply 2 pieces of wood just glued together. We're going to reinforce this miter. We're going to do it a little differently. I made a jig. A jig is something you could use on the machines to make your life easier. Remember when I was marking things out to be 3/8 of an inch and I had a whole bunch of them to mark out? I didn't measure with a tape measure 17 times. I cut a piece of wood, 1 piece 3/8, and I butted it up against where I wanted to measure from, and I marked them all off. On this, I'm going to reinforce this with a spline. We talked about a spline before. You guys might want to follow me, because I always like these 2 projects, and I left these up. I look at Naomi's. She has that Purple Heart spline that is just absolutely beautiful on a walnut frame. That's what I want to put. I don't know that mine's going to be Purple Heart, because I can't afford it. She can. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to make that cut on the table saw to reinforce each one of these miters. I'm going to set up the dado head. If anybody knows what a dado head is, if you had a little lesson on the table saw, you should know that a dado head is a blade sandwich. It's 2 blades and a bunch of chippers on the inside. I'm going to make a cut that's going to be wider than 1/8 of an inch. That's the width of my blade. I want to make it so it stands out about 1/4 of an inch. That's what Naomi did, about 1/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take 2 blades, put them surface to surface on that table saw, and I'm going to slice through this corner, and I'll show you my jig that I made. But before I do that, I'm going to be changing the blade on that table saw. And if I got to the table saw, started to change it, I would realize that's pretty dangerous. Because Lord knows if that switch should go on, if anybody should go near there and hit that switch accidentally while my hands are in on the blade, it's going to be a real issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a walk over to this here breaker box, because I don't want to shut off the power in the entire shop. I just want to shut it off to my table saw. So if you follow me with your eyes, oh, you're coming. Oh, I'm going to open up my breaker box where I know my table saw is located, and I know it's that upper right-hand breaker. You notice that it's on in the on position. I'm going to shut it off. And now what we'll do is we'll take a walk over to the table saw, we'll switch out the blade, and we'll put the dado head on. Yeah, I know, walk this way, I know. Let's take a look at the table saw, and I'm going to move my fence out so I can work on this. First thing I want to do, I want to check to see if that power is on. So I'm going to press the power button, and the table saw does not go on, so I'm in good shape. I know that I've had some students where I'm working on the table saw, and I'll say, hey, could you shut off the breaker to the table saw? And when I check it, the breaker's still on. And they said, oh, I moved the wrong breaker. That's a convenient accident, isn't it? So always check to see that that power is off. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get my 7/8 open end wrench, which I know fits my table saw arbor nut, and I'm going to take my throat plate off. A lot of times on the saws, the throat plate, which covers that opening, has to be lifted up from the front, because on the back side, there might be a pin, and I have a pin on my throat plate. If you try to pull it up from the back, you'll never get it to go up because the pin kind of locks it in place. The next thing that I want to do is I want to take this nut off. That's my arbor nut. Here's my washer, and here's my 1/8 inch wide blade. To take the nut off, What I want to do is I'm going to put the wrench on it, and this is important to understand. There are several applications where that nut is not like that chuck key, is not like that spindle sander. That nut, instead of loosening counterclockwise, actually tightens counterclockwise. It's what's called a left-handed threaded nut. Why would you have a left-hand threaded nut on this table saw, on that radial arm saw, on that chop saw, on a propane tank? Tell you the truth, I don't know why on a propane tank, but all I know is that if I try to take that off, if I go counterclockwise, it will tighten. This is left-hand threaded because if I turn this machine on, and it would be a regular nut, every time I turn it on with the torque of the machine, that nut will loosen. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put my wrench on top of the nut, and I wanna move it clockwise or towards me to loosen, towards me to loosen, towards me to loosen, which will be a question on this old quiz. Which way do I take that blade off? With the arbor nut, and it is towards you to loosen. Not no. Towards you to loosen if you're standing on the front side of the table saw. If you notice, when I start to loosen this up, everything turns. I need to lock that blade in. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna reach down here and get a piece of scrap wood. Not a whole plank, just a piece of scrap wood. I take the scrap wood, I'm gonna put it inside of the tooth so that it's wedged in between the table and the tooth. Now I'm going to take my 7/8 open end wrench, put it on the nut, and now, cameraman, if you can get a shot of my face, watch how much torque, how much force it takes me to loosen this. Ready? Here we go. I think you might have used that force today, somehow, somewhere. If you notice, my neck wasn't struggling, my arm wasn't tight. It's snug, it is not super tight. It is just snug enough to hold the blade down. Not loose, not tight, but snug. The next thing I'm gonna do, with the power off, I'm gonna put my index finger on the arbor, which is that threaded rod, and I'm gonna move this nut towards me. The lighting in the shop is so good, it's easily seen, right? So here's my arbor nut that I took off. Oh, there you are. Here's my arbor nut. I love it when people take this and they throw it aside. And I always tell people, this is the only nut I have. Arbor nut. It's the only arbor nut I have, okay? I'm gonna take this, place it down on the table, the exact position that I took it off. The next thing I'll do is I'll remove the washer. I'm gonna remove the blade. I always like to put the blade on something that's wood so it doesn't dent or it doesn't dull. And the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a walk over here and pull up my old dado head. The dado head consists of blades and chippers. Every time you use the dado head, you will always use at least 2 blades. Question number 2. Whenever you use the dado head, how many blades do you use? And it is always 2. Because if I had to cut 1/4 of an inch wide, here are my 2 blades, 1/8 of an inch thick each one. If I need to cut 1/8 inch wide, why am I setting up the dado head? If I wanted to cut 3/8 of an inch wide, I use a blade, and I'm going to use this thing. No, it's not a Chinese ninja star. It's a chipper. So this chipper is 1/8 of an inch, but it just doesn't have the weight that these blades have. So if I wanted to set up a 3/8 wide cut, it would be blade, chipper, and it would be other blade. After I realize I'm just going to use those 2 blades, I'll put the dado head aside, and something that really important, and probably the most important thing you'll ever do on this table saw, is realize which way this blade has to face. You notice that the teeth have a hook to them. This is the front edge. If I were to take it and flip it around this way, so I'm cutting with the back side, it's not gonna cut, it's gonna burn. Just the force of this blade spinning that fast will actually sort of cut through it, but it'll definitely burn. So I always want the teeth facing towards me. And if you look at this, this tooth should face me as I put it in. So I'm going to take it, line up the arbor hole. With the arbor, I put one blade on. My second blade I'll put on as well. Remember, all this is done without any power. Washer goes in place, and nut caps it all off. I'm going to put it on. Most people have a ton of sawdust underneath their table saw. If you're one of those people, and if you drop that nut, and that might be the only arbor nut you have, you'll probably spend a long time looking for that nut. So I always say to people, you really got to be careful with that. Now I want to tighten this. So I take my scrap piece, instead of putting it in the front of the saw, I'm going to put it on the back side of the saw. I'm going to take my 7/8 open end wrench. I'm going to start to tighten this. And again, look at my face when I tighten this. Snug. Not crazy tight, snug. This is all set. My 1/4 inch dado head is set up. Now, if I put my regular throat plate on, I'll probably find that this width is not wide enough to accept that blade. So now what I want to do is see if I could get a larger throat plate. And wouldn't you know, as in Hollywood, it always works out. Here's my throat plate with a wider opening. I'm going to put the back side in first, drop the front side in. I'm all set, ready to go. The next thing that I want to do is I want to raise the blade up to the height that I want to cut. So I'm going to take my picture frame, hold this at about a 45-degree angle to the blade, and there's no reason to raise the blade that height. I don't want to cut through that corner. So what I want to do is I want to cut it. I'm going to go a little bit higher than that. I'm going to go maybe to about that area right there. Now, if I get a piece of scrap wood and I put a piece of scrap wood on here, it's a little bit more than 13/16 of an inch. It might be 15/16, might be a little bit less than an inch wide. That's something I want to keep in mind. But I've got that blade raised up to about an inch or so. The next thing I want to do is look at my spline miter jig, which is over here. I look at the blade, make sure it's set up correctly. Now I'm going to slide my fence over and place my jig on the fence. Now, here's what I like. Some people want the spline dead on centered in there. And I always say, if it's too far towards the back, it looks like you screwed up. So I'm going to favor the front side of this frame, and I'm not going to put it directly in the middle. I'm going to put it maybe about, maybe 3/8 of an inch from this front edge. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to eye up this area between the surface of my spline miter jig and the inside of the blade. I want that space to be about 3/8 of an inch. Where's 3/8 of an inch? If you've been doing this for 40 years, you can kind of guess that looks about 3/8 of an inch. Maybe a little too much. I'm going to slide it back a little bit. I think right about there looks pretty good. That's maybe a quarter, and maybe I'm making a little bit more. I'm going to go with it right there. Now, how can I find out where it's going to cut? I'm going to take my frame and cut it. No. Because if you screw up this frame and it's the wrong setting, you're done. So what I'm going to do is take a piece of scrap wood. This happens to be a piece of poplar, which is 13/16 of an inch thick. But if I put this surface up against my jig and make the cut, I could look to see what it's going to be like on the front surface of that cherry frame. So when I do this, I'm going to get a piece of scrap wood. I'm going to do this first. I turn the machine on, or I don't turn the machine on because the power's still off. So I'm going to take a walk back here. I'm going to try to look cool when I walk. How's that? And the best thing about growing up in this time frame is when you go like this, it looks like your fingers are broken. And I say to everybody, when you get your picture taken now and you do one of these, either people are going to say in 20 years or 30 years, boy, you're really like scissors, or were your fingers suffered from rheumatoid arthritis? You could just, we used to go like this, used to wave, hi, mom. None of this stuff, you know what I'm saying? Whatever, I'm going to take my scrap piece and I'm going to make my cut on my spline miter jig. I want to turn this on, but I always move my head away, and I'll tell you why later. So it's spinning. I'm going to take my scrap piece, put this surface up against the surface of the jig. I'm just going to move this in and see the cut. I always like to have the good surface or the good edge up against the jig. So if I look at this right here, I've probably cut, that looks a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch from that surface, because that's a surface that went up there. I want to make it greater than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually move my fence out a little bit. Let me move it out. And I also think that the blade is set a little high. I think that blade is definitely too high. So I'm going to lower the blade a bit. And before I cut, what do? I use a piece of scrap wood. I don't cut it on my frame. Let's try it again. See if this is a better cut. So that's up against the surface. That looks good. Remember, my board is 1 1/4 inches wide. That's about 3/8 of an inch or 5/16. I like that blade height. Maybe I'll raise that up just a hair. And I think I'm ready to cut my splines in my pieces. So here we go. Take this frame first. Like I said to you, a good habit is always put the good surface up against the jig. Notice where my hands are. I'm going to keep my left hand here, my right hand here, squeezing it up against the jig, and I'm simply just going to go across there and make the cut. Just like I do with my regular pieces, I never put my board on the jig and turn the saw on. I'll turn it on and then place it on the jig. Sleeves rolled up. Glasses on. I'm going to send it through. And I want to go slow with this. The reason is if I go too fast, sometimes it'll chip on that surface. That looks like a great cut. I like it favored towards the front. I don't want it centered. It's a good depth. It's going to reinforce that miter well. So I'm really happy with that. I'm going to cut the other 7 miters. This is the frame for my son, so if I screw it up, I don't really care about it. No, I do. Love that kid. Last one on this one. Oh, did I do that one already? Oops. Mind is not on your work, right? That's what happens all the time. You're always thinking because everything matters. Took my time and I went slow, so I have spline, 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 spline. This one's all set. Now I'll move to my daughter's frame. That's the good one. You know, she's a film producer, technical director to this shooting. Oh, yes. What I do if I'm doing this a lot is I just spin it in a certain direction, in this case clockwise. Making sure that my good edge or a good surface is always up against the jig, and there's no reason for me to check these. And of course I didn't cut one twice over here, because I was thinking what I was doing the whole time. So there are my splines. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change this blade out, but you saw me take it and put it on. So let me just go over here and take this off before we surface some wood down for my splines. So I'll take this, move the fence out. What I'm going to do, I know! Whoa! Yikes! The power is on. I don't want to do that. So here's what we're going to do, or here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to run over there, shut the power off. I'm going to give you guys a chance to decompress or decompose or something. I'll shut the power off. I'm going to take this dado head, get that back off, put a regular blade back on. Later on, I'm going to meet you over to the surfacer. We'll see if we can't surface a piece of wood for our spines. Maybe you guys can help me out with the color that I'm going to choose for that spine. Have a great one, and I'll see you back in a little bit.